Mist drifted over the swamp in thick grey sheets, clinging to the lowland reeds and skimming the surface of dark waters. Margaret Clement stepped carefully along the muddy path, her boots squelching with each step. The hem of her once elegant skirt was damp, streaked with mud. Her wicker basket, nearly empty, hung at her side, while her free hand gripped the frayed edge of her shawl. This was her route to town, an isolated track cutting through the wetlands, the quickest but most treacherous path. She made the journey often enough to know the safe ground, but each trip was a test. The swamp was indifferent, a place where a misplaced step could mean a slow, sinking death. To those who glimpsed her from a distance, she was simply the Lady of the Swamp, a solitary, weathered figure in tattered finery, trudging towards the shops for her weekly essentials. Flour, tea, tinned meat, the small comforts that her dwindling savings could still afford. But how had it come to this? How had Margaret Clement, a woman once surrounded by luxury and sophistication, become this isolated figure navigating the muck? Welcome to Strewth, a podcast where we delve into the most perplexing mysteries Australia has ever witnessed. For our international listeners wondering about the peculiar title, Strewth is what Aussies mutter when confronted by something so extraordinary it leaves you gobsmacked. Derived from God's truth, it's what the old-timers would say before launching into a tale so bizarre the listeners might think they were spinning yarns. It's our way of saying, I know what I'm about to tell you sounds like complete nonsense, but fair dinkum, every word is true. In a country where truth is often stranger than fiction, Strewth is our verbal oath that no embellishment is needed when the facts themselves defy belief. And today's story, well, it's certainly a strange one. I'm your host, and today we're travelling to the lush landscape of South Gippsland, Victoria. Before this region became world famous for a recent mushroom poisoning incident that captivated international headlines, there was another mystery that haunted these rolling hills and wetlands. One that unfolded decades earlier, but remains just as baffling. This is the story of Margaret Clement, known to history as the Lady of the Swamp, a woman who journeyed from extraordinary wealth to isolated poverty in a grand mansion that slowly sank into a swamp, and whose mysterious disappearance in 1952 remains one of Victoria's most enduring cold cases. Margaret's story reads like a tragic fairy tale in reverse. Born into privilege as the daughter of a wealthy pastoralist who made his fortune during the gold rush, she travelled the world in luxury, attended by servants, wanting for nothing, yet she would end her days alone in a crumbling mansion, surrounded by an encroaching swamp, living without electricity or running water, before vanishing without a trace. What happened to Margaret Clement? Was she the victim of those who coveted her property? Did she meet with a tragic accident in the treacherous swampland? Or did something more sinister befall this vulnerable heiress who had fallen so far from the glittering heights of Melbourne society? To understand Margaret's fate, we must first understand the extraordinary wealth from which she fell. Peter Clement Sr., a Scottish immigrant who arrived during Victoria's 1854 gold rush, wasn't content to simply dig for gold. While others panned streams and worked claims, Peter invested shrewdly in the Long Tunnel gold mine at Walhalla, amassing a fortune estimated between £50,000 and £100,000, millions in today's currency. By the time of his death in 1890, Peter had built a property empire that included Prospect Station, a magnificent 4,000-acre holding, along with multiple other properties across Victoria, totalling thousands of acres. He left behind 6 children who would inherit this substantial wealth, though in a telling sign of the heir's attitude towards women, his widow, Jane, received only £200, plus a modest annual annuity. Margaret Clement was born on March the 8th, 1881, the third of these 6 children. Each sibling's story would illustrate how quickly inherited wealth could vanish without proper stewardship. Flora, the the eldest, married and moved to Ballarat, living comfortably but modestly. William served in the Great War and returned suffering what we would now recognise as shell shock, struggling to manage his portion of the inheritance. Peter Jr., who would initially manage the family's crown jewel property, left that responsibility after his 1912 marriage, and his life ended tragically in 1944 with a gunshot wound to the head, likely suicide. Anna squandered her inheritance on an extravagant lifestyle in St Kilda, and Jeannie, Margaret's closest companion, would die of natural causes in 1950, leaving Margaret completely alone. In 1907, Margaret and Jeannie purchased what they believed would be their perfect home, Tullaree Estate, a magnificent 2,000-acre property at Tarwin Lower. For £20,000 they acquired a 17-room brick mansion, extensive outbuildings and what initially appeared to be productive farmland. They staffed the estate with 11 servants and furnished it with Japanese artefacts and European pieces, entertaining what one contemporary described as the cream of Edwardian society. But little did they know, Tullaree sat on reclaimed swampland, and the sisters had purchased not just a property, but an ongoing battle with nature itself. What the Clement sisters couldn't have known was that Tullaree's fertile farmland existed only through constant human intervention. The property required sophisticated drainage systems to prevent the Tarwin River from flooding back into what had originally been wetland. When brother Peter Jr. left management responsibilities after his marriage in 1912, the sisters inherited not just a grand estate, but a complex agricultural operation they were ill-equipped to maintain. Margaret and Jeannie lacked both farming knowledge and the financial resources needed to properly maintain the intricate network of drainage ditches and pumping systems. By the 1920s, their troubles multiplied. Dishonest employees, poor management decisions, and the economic impacts of the Great War and Great Depression all took their toll. A protective caveat placed on the property title in 1926 prevented immediate eviction by mortgagees, but it couldn't prevent the natural disaster slowly unfolding around them. Without proper maintenance, the drainage systems failed. The swamp began its inexorable reclamation of Tullaree. The transformation was gradual but relentless. Each flood season saw water levels rise a little higher, stay a little longer. By the 1930s, what had once been productive farmland had become permanent wetland. The sisters watched helplessly as their inheritance literally sank beneath the surface. The major flood in 1934 demonstrated the area's vulnerability, but worse was to come. By the 1940s, the mansion itself had become an island surrounded by chest-deep water. The once elegant tree-lined drive was impassable. The formal gardens had disappeared beneath stagnant pools breeding mosquitoes and disease. Margaret and Jeannie had found themselves prisoners of their own property. To reach Buffalo for supplies required an 11-kilometre round trip, wading through dangerous swamp conditions. They lived without electricity, without running water, without adequate sanitation. Their diet consisted largely of cold tin baked beans and bread. The 17-room mansion that had once hosted Melbourne society now sheltered two ageing women eating cold food by candlelight, listening to the night sounds of a swamp that grew bolder with each passing season. Local residents, remembering the glamorous women who had once entertained the district's elite, began referring to Margaret as the Lady of the Swamp, a title that captured both her former status and her current extraordinary circumstances. Following Jeannie's death in July 1950, Margaret faced her greatest vulnerability. At 71, she was entirely alone in the decaying mansion, dependent on the charity of neighbours and what remained of her dwindling savings. It was at this moment of maximum isolation that Stanley Russell Livingston ended her life. Stanley was no random opportunist. A former Footscray footballer, now working for the Country Roads Board, he lived with his wife Esme on a small farm at Menion. The couple had been observing Margaret's situation and Stanley approached her isolation with the calculated patience of a predator who understood exactly what he was hunting. The Livingstons presented themselves as concerned neighbours, offering friendship to a grieving woman who had few visitors and even fewer friends. Stanley would arrive with small gifts, assistance with minor repairs, conversation about local affairs, all the kindness that Margaret's isolation made precious beyond measure. But Stanley's true interest wasn't charity, it was property. Even in its swamped condition, Tullaree represented valuable land that could be acquired for a fraction of its potential worth. All that was required was removing the protective legal barriers and convincing a vulnerable elderly woman to sign the appropriate documents. The manipulation was methodical and legally sophisticated. Stanley engaged his own solicitor to arrange removal of the protective caveat that had been placed on Tullaree's title in 1926. This crucial legal protection, which had prevented creditors from seizing the property during the sisters' financial difficulties, was quietly eliminated. In 1951, Stanley convinced Margaret to sell Tullaree to him for just £3,000, with an additional £12,500 paid to discharge the outstanding mortgages. The total transaction appeared to be $15,500, but the reality was even more cynical. Stanley borrowed back $2,700 of the £3,000 he had supposedly paid Margaret, meaning his actual cash outlay was minimal. Even more manipulatively, Stanley arranged for Margaret to write a new will, removing her nephew Clement Carnahan as beneficiary. In exchange, Stanley promised to build a cottage where Margaret could live for the remainder of her life. It was a promise he had no intention of keeping. The legal documents were signed, the transfers completed, and suddenly Margaret found herself no longer the owner of Tullaree, but merely a tenant dependent on Stanley's continued goodwill. She had been transformed from property owner to squatter on the land her family had owned for decades. Margaret Clement was last seen alive on May the 21st, 1952. When Stanley and Esme Livingston called at Tullaree on May the 22nd and received no response to their knocking, they departed without entering the property. It wasn't until May the 25th that Stanley reported Margaret missing to the police, a 3-day delay that would immediately raise suspicions. The circumstances were troubling from the outset. Margaret's walking stick was found at the house, and every local resident insisted she never ventured outside without it. For a woman who had spent years navigating treacherous swamp conditions, leaving her essential mobility aid behind, it was inexplicable. Detective Senior Sergeant Bill Townsend was assigned to lead what would become one of Victoria's longest-running murder investigations. More than 100 people joined the initial search, including police, neighbours, and even an Aboriginal tracker. But the swamp conditions, icy waters, driving rain, and harsh gales hampered their efforts from the beginning. As the investigation deepened, disturbing evidence emerged. Margaret's dog Dingo had been found dead in March 1952, a full 2 months before her disappearance. The animal's throat had been cut in what investigators described as a clean, straight wound that clearly indicated human agency. Police viewed this killing as either intimidation designed to isolate Margaret further or a rehearsal for more serious violence to come. Contemporary witnesses reported seeing unknown men in a big black car, asking locals how to find the Swamp Lady in the weeks before Margaret's disappearance. The inquiry suggested premeditation. Someone had been planning to locate Margaret specifically. The case immediately captured public attention. The Melbourne newspaper, The Argus, provided extensive coverage, publishing front-page stories for 6 consecutive days in May and June 1952. The combination of wealth, isolation, and mysterious disappearance proved irresistible to both press and public. But despite the intensive search efforts and media attention, no trace of Margaret was found. The swamp that had claimed her fortune and her home appeared to have claimed Margaret herself. Margaret was declared legally dead on July the 29th, 1954, opening the way for a bitter legal battle over Tullery's ownership. Her disinherited nephew, Clement Carnahan, engaged prominent criminal lawyer Frank Galbally to contest the 1951 will and property sale, claiming undue influence and questioning Margaret's mental capacity when she signed the crucial documents. The legal proceedings revealed the full extent of the Livingstons' manipulation and the extraordinary profits they stood to gain. Despite Chief Justice Sir Edmund Herring ultimately ruling in the Livingstons' favour in 1955, the couple's financial windfall raised persistent questions about their motives. In 1956, just 4 years after Margaret's disappearance, the Livingstons sold Tullery for £67,500, more than 22 times their purchase price and representing a 350% return on their total investment. This massive windfall transformed Stanley into a very wealthy man, allowing him to relocate to Curtis Island, Queensland, where he lived comfortably until his death in 1992. The profits were so extraordinary that they seemed to provide clear motive for murder. But suspicion and legal proof are very different matters, and Detective Senior Sergeant Bill Townsend found himself investigating a case where the likely perpetrators had protected themselves with sophisticated legal manoeuvring. The investigation continued for 40 years, with Townsend maintaining the case files until Esme Livingston's death in 1993. Throughout those decades, disturbing rumours persisted. Esme reportedly told friends that she knew who had killed Margaret and feared that her husband would murder her too if she spoke publicly. But she died in 1993 without ever providing formal testimony. In November 1978, 26 years after Margaret's disappearance, hope for resolution suddenly emerged from an unexpected direction. Skeletal remains of an elderly woman were discovered in a shallow grave at Venus Bay, just kilometres from the former Tullery estate. The discovery, along with a hammer and spade that had been found in the area in 1968, and a woman's handbag, lace shawl, and pre-1952 coins that were found in 1979, raised the possibility that Margaret's remains had finally been located. The items seemed to match the time period and circumstances of her disappearance, but forensic science in the late 1970s lacked the sophisticated techniques available today. Medical experts disagreed about the fundamental aspects of the remains. Some believed the skeletal structure indicated a European woman of approximately Margaret's age and build. However, others argued the skull's characteristics suggested Aboriginal ancestry. The debate was crucial because positive identification would have allowed police to proceed with murder charges against the Livingstons, who were still alive and could potentially be prosecuted. But without definitive identification, the investigation remained stalled. A 1980 coronial inquest examined all available evidence, including the suspicious circumstances of Margaret's disappearance and the Livingstons' extraordinary financial gains. The coroner noted the unsatisfactory nature of evidence given by the Livingstons, but ultimately returned an open verdict. The skeletal remains could not be positively identified as Margaret Clement. Recent analysis using more advanced techniques has suggested the remains likely belonged to an Aboriginal woman, making it increasingly unlikely they were Margaret's. The Venus Bay discovery, which had seemed to offer the possibility of justice, ultimately deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Detective Senior Sergeant Bill Townsend never abandoned his pursuit of justice for Margaret Clement. For 40 years he maintained the case files, followed up on occasional tips, and waited for the breakthrough that would allow him to prove what he believed he already knew. The investigation revealed a pattern of careful planning and legal sophistication that set this case apart from typical crimes of opportunity. The removal of protective legal caveats, the manipulation of wills, and the systematic isolation of the victim all suggested perpetrators who understood both the legal system and their victim's psychology. Townsend's investigation also uncovered the broader context of elder abuse and property manipulation that made Margaret's fate tragically common, if rarely so spectacular. In an era before modern protections for vulnerable adults, elderly property owners with diminished social connections were particularly susceptible to exploitation. The case files grew thick with witness statements, financial records and circumstantial evidence. But the perfect crime, if indeed that's what this was, had been executed with sufficient legal cover to make prosecution impossible. The perpetrators had hidden behind property law, probate procedures and the simple passage of time. When Stanley Livingstone died in 1992, followed by Esme's death in 1993, the last hope for a confession or breakthrough testimony died with them. The case remained officially open, but practically speaking, justice for Margaret Clement had become impossible. Today, visitors to the former Tullery estate would find little to remind them of the swamp that once claimed the Clement sisters' fortune and possibly Margaret's life. Modern drainage systems have eliminated the wetland conditions that characterised the property during Margaret's final years. The land that was once chest deep in stagnant water now supports a successful cattle and poultry operation. The mansion itself has been fully restored to its former glory and recognised as the most substantial Victorian Federation house in South Gippsland Shire. Where Margaret once ate cold beans by candlelight, modern occupants enjoy all contemporary conveniences. The transformation is so complete that the property's tragic history seems almost impossible to believe. 2019, Tullery sold for approximately $7.2 million. In March 2025, it was put up for public sale again. The first time in 70 years it had been publicly marketed. The property that Stanley Livingstone had acquired through manipulation for £15,500 and sold for £67,500 is now worth more than 100 times his original investment. The massive profits that may have motivated Margaret's murder have grown exponentially, making the Livingstones' original scheme seem almost modest by comparison. Yet this extraordinary appreciation also underscores just how valuable Margaret's property was and how much the Livingstones stood to gain from her disappearance. For Margaret's surviving relatives and those who remember her story, the property's transformation offers both hope and melancholy. The land has recovered from the environmental disaster that claimed the Clement fortune, but justice for Margaret herself remains forever beyond reach. The case of Margaret Clement has generated significant cultural interest over the decades. Richard Shears, an award-winning international journalist, wrote the definitive account in his book Swamp, Who Murdered Margaret Clement. His extensive research and interviews created what remains the most comprehensive examination of the case available to the public. The Australian Dictionary of Biography provides the authoritative academic treatment, though it notes somewhat controversially that Margaret was more certainly the victim of media frenzy than of any murder, a conclusion that many people who study the evidence would dispute. More recently, ABC Rewind produced a podcast series examining the case, and various true crime analyses have kept Margaret's story alive for new generations. Artists including Heather Shimmin and writer Janine Webb have found creative inspiration in the haunting image of the Lady of the Swamp, ensuring her story continues to resonate in Australian cultural imagination. The case, however, remains officially unsolved with an open verdict, though it no longer appears among Victorian Police's active cold case investigations. The last official statement came in 1997 when a Melbourne coroner described it as one of the great unsolved mysteries, but not one beyond resolution. But, as we know, resolution requires evidence, witnesses and time, all of which have worked against justice for Margaret Clement. So, as the mist rises over the reclaimed farmlands that once formed Tullery Estate, I find myself thinking about Margaret Clement's extraordinary journey. From inherited wealth to systematic exploitation, from social isolation to probable murder. Hers is a story that illuminates the darkest possibilities lurking beneath the surface of seemingly respectable communities. Perhaps what's most disturbing about Margaret's fate is how preventable it might have been. The warning signs were all there. The isolation, the financial vulnerability, the sudden appearance of overly helpful strangers with their own legal representation. But in 1950s Australia, protections for vulnerable, elderly citizens were minimal, and the social networks that might have intervened had been eroded by years of swamp-imposed isolation. We may never know with certainty what happened to Margaret on May the 21st, 1952. Did she finally realise the extent of her exploitation and threaten to expose the Livingstons? Did she attempt to reclaim her property or her will? Or did Stanley simply decide that an elderly woman who knew too much about his manipulations would become an unacceptable risk? The swamp that claimed Tullaree has been drained now, the land reclaimed and productive once again. But somewhere in the wetlands of South Gippsland, Margaret Clement's remains may still lie hidden, preserved in the airless mud that claimed her home and possibly her life. The Lady of the Swamp took her secrets with her, leaving behind one of Australia's most compelling unsolved mysteries. Strewth, what a story. Thanks for listening to Strewth. If this tale of exploitation, disappearance and enduring mystery kept you captivated, follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you tell someone about it too. Next week we'll be exploring the extraordinary story of Arthur Upfield, the crime novelist whose fictional murder plot became the blueprint for real-life killings in the Australian outback. It's a chilling tale of life imitating art that shocked the nation and forever changed Upfield's legacy. But until then, stay curious, stay questioning, and I'll catch you next time.